The prophet Hosea, it's a little bit longer than some of the other books, and not as long as, say, Zechariah, but it's a little longer. And its message is much like that of Amos, but it's structured in a different way. You basically have two parts in the book. The first three chapters are primarily focused on Hosea and his experience with Gomer, and God using that to frame the context for the second half of the book, which is about God's relationship with unfaithful Israel. And so we have the story of a man and a faithless wife, and what God tells him to do, which reflects the character and the mercy and the grace of God, and how God wants to deal with Israel. But at the same time, the seriousness of her offenses and how that reflects the seriousness of the relationship that God has with the nation. We introduced the book last week with background from chapters 9 through 17 in 2 Kings, and we still encourage you to keep going back and referring to that as you might need to, so you can have a better understanding of some of the things that may be referenced in the book. Let's start by reading at verse 2 of Hosea chapter 1. The beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea. And the Lord said to Hosea, Go take unto thee a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, which conceived and bare him a son. And the Lord said unto him, Call his name Jezreel. For yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. And it shall come to pass at that day, I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. And she conceived again and bare a daughter, and God said unto him, Call her name Lo-ruhamah, for I will no more have mercy upon the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. But I will have mercy upon the house of Judah, and will save them by the Lord their God, and will not save them by bow, nor by sword, nor by battle, by horses, nor by horsemen. Now when she had weaned Lo-ruhamah, she conceived and bare a son. Then said God, Call his name Lo-ammi, for ye are not my people, and I will not be your God. Let the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered, and it shall come to pass that in the place where it is said unto them, Ye are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, Ye are the sons of the living God. Then shall the children of Judah and the children of Israel be gathered together and appoint themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. Now, it's pretty obvious, I think, that Hosea, by the Spirit, is making a play on these names based on their meaning. And the word Jezreel in the context is the most significant, because the word Jezreel itself has a double meaning. So you've got a figurative and a literal application based upon a word that has a double meaning. Okay, so it can get confusing, but if you'll just think a little bit, it'll work itself out. So you have this man, Hosea, who marries a woman whose name is Gomer. And verse 3 says that she conceived and bare him a son. Now, I think that's important that you notice that in verse 3, because in verse 5, she conceived again and bare a daughter. Now, notice the difference in the language. And then in verse 8, now when she had weaned Lo-ruhamah, she conceived and bare a son. Now, Gomer was a daughter of whoredoms. This doesn't mean she was a prostitute per se, but she was an immoral woman. And it doesn't mean that she necessarily was an unchaste woman even at the time that they married. But she was a woman who was of whoredoms, and she bare children of whoredoms. And the word whoredom or adulteress or harlot in this context is referring to the spiritual condition of the people Israel more than it is talking about their moral condition. But their moral condition is directly connected to their spiritual condition. In other words, this woman did play the harlot. I think verse 6 and verse 8 make that clear. She married Hosea, she conceived and bare him a son. But the next one says she conceived and bare a daughter. It doesn't tell us whose father was. And then again in verse 8, she conceived and bare a son. It doesn't tell us who the father was. Now that may not be conclusive, but once you know the story and you see how this plays out in the book, I think it becomes evident. And if you've read the whole book at least once before we've started the study, you'll see that I'm on the right track here, I think. So she and Hosea had a child together. They start out well, have a child. But she is so full of what's going on in her time. She is a daughter or a wife of whoredoms. That kind of language is used over and again in Scripture. Look at, even in the book here, look at chapter 4 and verse 11. Whoredom and wine and new wine take away the heart. My people ask counsel of their stocks, and their staff declareth unto them, for the spirit of whoredoms has caused them to err, and they have gone a-whoring from under their God. So the spirit of whoredoms, the mind of whoredoms, the heart of whoredoms. They lived in a wicked age. They were surrounded by people who were going up to the high places. We saw in Amos that the prophet Amos had said that some would be harlots in the city, and that he would not chasten the women who became harlots because their husbands and their fathers were whoremongers. And they went up to the high place, and a man and his son took the same maid on the garment that was laid to pledge. I mean, that's just vile, I understand, but that's what these people were doing. And so this is what Gomer gets involved in. She was reared in that context, and she married a man, but she continued or entered into that kind of behavior. Chapter 5 and verse 4 of Hosea. They will not frame their doings to turn to their God, for the spirit of whoredoms is in the midst of them, and they have not known the Lord. So here you have false religion that promotes immorality that results in separation from God, rejection of God. This is the pattern throughout history. Just look at Romans chapter 1. What did they do? They made images after the animals and the things that were around them. They bowed down to them. They sought them. And what happened to them? They went so far into depravity that they even entered into homosexuality. And I make this point, I made it the other day to a young preacher because we were talking about gambling, and I suggested to him at the time, I said, look, all issues, whether we're talking about moral issues or we're talking about issues that pertain to the worship of the church, or we're talking about things that pertain to organization of the church, or any question of right and wrong is always resolved by a matter of Bible authority. Now, if you reject the ultimate source of authority, or at least reject the expression of the ultimate source of authority, which is the Bible, or you depart from that in such a way as that you try to convince yourself that there are lots of things we do that we don't have Bible authority for. How many times have I heard that in 45 years of preaching? I've lost count. Oh, there's lots of things we do that we don't have Bible authority for. My standard answer now is speak for yourself. So just speak for yourself on that. There are lots of things you do that you don't have Bible authority for. We don't talk about the rest of us. We have Bible authority, and you may think there are some things that you do that you don't have Bible authority for, and you say, well, you do them too, but let me tell you something. We think we have Bible authority for it, and if we don't, we'll quit it. So that's the point. But that old saw, well, we do lots of things we don't have Bible authority for, or you're just a Bible thumper, or you're a bibliolater. First time I ever heard that, I was preaching at Camden, and of all things, the Christian church preacher called me a bibliolater and a Campbellite. And I said, well, back up, brother, because if there's anybody in this room that's a Campbellite, it's you. Because Alexander Campbell was the first president of the American Christian Missionary Society, and that's your organization, not mine. And then to refer to me as a bibliolater, someone who worships the Bible. No, I worship God. And I listen to what God has said, and where does God speak to me? He speaks to me in the Word. But those folks in Romans chapter 1, they no longer desire to retain God in their knowledge. That's what the passage says. So what happened? So they enter into this downward spiral towards depravity. And you look at religion today. I'm not bragging, I'm just stating a fact. And you'll see how naive I was. But I never knew what a homosexual was until I went to college. And I'm glad I didn't, all right? But that's just the truth. I never knew what a homosexual was until I went to college. And then I had to read about it in the school paper. But this is the kind of world I grew up in where we just didn't know about those kinds of things. And I never saw anybody intoxicated in my life until I went to college. College was a very enlightening experience for me. Most of it not very good. But now, since then, that was 1976 that I went to college and stayed there a couple of years. Well, it was the early 80s, and you've got the homosexual movement coming to light, and you've got the Lutherans and the Episcopalians arguing amongst themselves about whether or not they will receive homosexuals, and they were forbidding that their clergy could be participants in homosexuality. And then by the middle of the 90s, I was debating the fellow on the radio who was the first ordained Episcopal priest that was an openly practicing homosexual. Now, when a religious group gives up Bible authority, that's where they're going to end up. And that's where the Christian church has ended up. The disciples of Christ, they are public advocates of homosexuality, the ordination of women. And let me tell you something. Our brethren who have started putting women in the pulpit and women into the eldership are not far behind those fellas. Why? Because they have rejected Bible authority. Now, that's what this is all about. And so here's a woman who is living among a people who have no respect for God, no respect for His word, and God describes their behavior as whoredom because they have forsaken His covenant under the figure of a marriage covenant. They have forsaken His covenant, and they've gone after these false gods. So that's what you have here in the book of Hosea. So they have departed from the Lord, verse 2. So he took Gomer, and she conceived and bare him a son. And God said, call his name Jezreel. And Jezreel, I said, it had a double meaning. It can mean one of two things. It can mean to scatter, or it can mean to sow. You see, the same action will do it. But you scatter, you don't necessarily sow by scattering. You can sow by scattering, but not all scattering is sowing, and so we need to realize that. And so Hosea is making a play on that word. Now, literally, Jezreel was another name for the valley of Megiddo, which in the New Testament is called Armageddon. Right? So Armageddon, or Harmageddon with an H sometimes, and Megiddo without the prefix in the Old Testament, and Jezreel are all referring to the same place. And it's that huge valley that extends from the River Jordan in the south to the mid-range area of the northern kingdom, and swings all the way up to Mount Carmel. And it ties in then to the way that the enemies of Israel would come, the Syrians and then the Assyrians and then ultimately the Babylonians, and even the Romans came this way, though they came from the west. They come into the north, and there where the river Euphrates marks the boundary of the kingdom of Israel, they would cross the river Euphrates, and then they would come down that valley that skirted the Lebanon mountains, and then turn towards the southeast into the valley of Megiddo, right there at Mount Carmel. You can look at your map if you want to see this. And then that would be the way that they would come into the land. And so they'd miss that mountain range. They'd come right down the coast, which there was a lot of people, a lot of cities there. They would take those cities. Lachish is up there in that area. They'd come in that way. Then they would turn, and they would come on this side, that is the west side of Jordan, and would come up through the natural pass there, take Jericho, and then on up to Jerusalem. And so this is how these armies always came into the land. It was a natural defense as well as a natural entrance. It was the only way to get in. Elsewise, you're going to have to cross the mountains or cross the Jordan. You know how the Jordan floods in the spring, which that's the time the kings go to war. So they had natural defenses on the west except for that one way. And this is how they came in. Or on the east, excuse me. And this is how they came in on the western side of that mountain range. So Jezreel is the name of that big valley there. And so God says, call his name Jezreel. For a little while I will avenge the blood of Jezreel. Now the blood of Jezreel is a reference back to Jehu. And we talked about Jehu. The last 4 kings that really reigned in the northern kingdom were Jehu, his son, grandson, and great-grandson, of whom Jeroboam II is that great-grandson. Excuse me, is the grandson, and then right after him, his son, Zechariah, who only reigned 6 months. I got that all wrong. Back up. It's Jehu, and then another one, and Jeroboam, and then no, it's Jehu, Joash, Jeroboam, Zechariah. I got it there. Okay. Jehu, Joash, Jeroboam, Zechariah. So Jeroboam is the one currently on the throne. He is the greatest, really, of the 3. But he is the last one. And this is a time of relative prosperity, but it's on the waning days of that. God is letting the enemies come in, and they should be waking up, but they're not. That's all, things are too good. Can't be the end of things. It's just a little setback. So there, in that period of the closing days, and Jezreel, the blood of Jezreel, is the blood of Jehu, or that line of kings who have been so unfaithful to God. God had told Jehu, you go kill Ahab and all his descendants, which he did. He killed Ahab's 70 sons, he killed Jezebel, and then God took care of Azariah down in the south. And then Athaliah was the last one, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. And he gets rid of her. And then the boy king comes to the throne, Jehoiada the priest and Jehoash the boy king. And there's 7 years in there of trouble down in the south. And so got turmoil in both kingdoms. But Jezreel had done what God said do, but then he didn't take away the golden calf. He got rid of the Baal. He slew all the prophets of Baal, but he didn't get rid of the golden calf. And God said, well, you've done a good job, but you didn't do everything I want you to do. Your sons will reign to the 4th generation. And each one of them after Jehu was excessively worse. So much so that the last one, Zechariah, was only allowed to reign 6 months. And God took him out. All right. So I'm going to avenge the blood. So the blood of Jezreel is not that blood of Ahab's house, because that's what God told him to do, but rather the blood associated with all of this disobedience and rebellion and idolatry that's been going on up in the northern kingdom. And you have Amos as a good background for all the oppression that's been going on. This is what he's going to, this is the blood of Jezreel, not the killing of those wicked kings and their descendants, but rather all of the terrible oppression and sin that's been allowed to continue because they were worshiping the golden calf. So he says, I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu and will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. And so that's going to happen. That fourth son's going to be cut off in the 6th month. And it shall come to pass that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Of course, that's when the Assyrians come in. They come right down through into the valley of Jezreel and take Samaria and besiege that place for 3 years. And if you ever want to read about how awful it was, just go back and read Josephus or some of them. So God's using that Jezreel. I'm going to scatter Israel, you see. Because he says, I'm going to break the bow. I'm going to completely destroy them as a nation. So then she, Gomer, conceived again and bare a daughter. And God said unto him, call her name Lo-ruhamah, which means no mercy. For I will no more have mercy upon the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. So this second child, who is not Hosea's probably, it's called no mercy or no pity. I will have no pity. Now, it's a general thing. It's not an absolute truth, but it's a general truth that a man who has a wife that conceives a child by another man, he generally is not very interested in that child. See, no mercy, no pity, no affection. I'm not saying that's how Hosea behaved, but that's the symbolism behind the name. I'm not going to have any mercy on this one. But I will have mercy on the house of Judah. That's the southern kingdom. And will save them by the Lord their God, and will not save them by bow, by sword, by battle, by horses, nor by horsemen. That happens in the days of Hezekiah. That's chapter 18 and following in 2 Kings. Hezekiah had tried to buy off the king of Assyria with gold from the temple. What happens when you pay a blackmailer money? They come back for more. And so what happens when you give your milk money to the bully? He comes back for more. And so Hezekiah, he thought he bought this guy off, and the next thing you know, there he is again, the little Rabshakeh. I always think of him as a little short guy because he stood on that rock or whatever and hollered up to the wall. I kind of thought he's a fella had an identity crisis or something. But he's a bully. He's obviously a bully in that narrative. And so he's trying to bully the king of Israel, and it worked once, so why not again, you know? And so they take the letter that he wrote and give it to Hezekiah, and he goes in before God in the temple, there at the door of the temple, and just lays that thing out. And says, God, this is what this fellow says about you. And he sends in the prophet Isaiah, and the prophet Isaiah gives him a revelation that says, you don't give in to this fella, and I'll deliver you. And so Hezekiah stands, and God does deliver them. And you remember that's when the 185,000 are smitten by the destroyer in the middle of the night. We talked about that a little bit. So there's how God saved them, not by bow, by sword, by battle, by horses, nor by horsemen. God just came in the middle of the night, slew them. They got up and left. And then the next one, verse 8. Now when she had weaned Lo-ruhamah, she conceived and bare a son. And I think that's significant. It says when she had weaned Lo-ruhamah, she conceived and bare a son. You remember over there in Genesis chapter 18, I believe it is. No, it's 21, in chapter 21. 18 is when God comes and visits Abraham in the plain of Mamre. Either chapter 19 is Sodom and Gomorrah, chapter 20 is his trip down among the Philistines, and then so chapter 21 I believe, is the birth and weaning of Isaac. And so when you do the math on that, Isaac was weaned about 3 years old. And of course, no baby formula and all that, ladies, so it was child going to have mother's milk. And the child was generally weaned about 3 years old. So, and we all are familiar with the course of nature. So during that time, she's got to be able to feed that child. But just as soon as she could get rid of that child, it says, as soon as it was weaned, she's out and got her a man. And that's just how awful this is. And she conceives and bears a child. And God says, call his name, this is a son again, Lo-Ami, for ye are not my people. Generally a man wants to have a son. He may or may not have a son, but he wants to have a son to carry on the family name. And to have more than one son is a great blessing, because that means your family name is going to survive for quite a while, perhaps. Me, I had 2 girls, and I don't have any brothers who married, and so I'm it. I'm the last of my line. There won't be any more Ashers. But here he had one who was of Hosea, but he names this other one, not my people. So this is not his son. And that's a terrible thing to realize that. And God uses that to teach Israel, says, you are not my people. Why are you not my people? Because you've broken the covenant. Lo-Ami was Gomer, but she wasn't Hosea, see? That's the point. And so Israel was still the Israelite people, but she'd gone a-whoring after these idols. And so she no longer was in a covenant relationship with God. And so, and there you have kind of a double figure where the nation is the wife and then the individuals of the nation are the children, you see. But the point is that they were forsaking God. And so let the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea. Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered, and it shall come to pass in that place where it was said, ye are not my people, it shall be said unto them, you are the sons of the living God. Now, what is the first part of that verse a reference to? Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea. Where's that come from? That's right, Sonny, the promise to Abraham. That's Genesis 15, and that's the chapter, we've studied it in our Galatians lessons, that's the chapter where God says that it was reckoned unto Abraham for righteousness. What was? His faith. So here, he's talking about people of faith like Abraham, and Paul picks up on that argument in the book of Romans and talks about the fact that we are to walk in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham, and he particularly applies that in, I think that's Romans chapter 9. Let's see if we can find that over there. Back up in the says verse 19, because this is directed at Jews, and Paul says, thou wilt say then, why doth he yet find fault? For who hath resisted his will? And this is that ridiculous argument that they had made earlier in the book in chapter 3, where basically they said, well, if the will of God was that the Gentiles should come in and that Israel would demonstrate their lack of faith by rejecting the Gentiles and opposing God and living in sin, says, why are you fussing at us? Because that's the will of God. It's a ridiculous argument, but that didn't keep them from making it. Because God had just said, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and whom he will, he hardeneth, talking about Pharaoh. Right? Well, why was Pharaoh's heart hardened? Because Pharaoh hardened his heart. 5 times it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. 5 times it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. How did God harden Pharaoh's heart? By showing him the miracles, sending him Moses, giving him the commandment, and then letting Pharaoh make a choice. He did not compel Pharaoh to do anything, you see. And when God let Pharaoh go, when he slacked up on him, what did Pharaoh do? He changed his mind. He flopped every time. Because he didn't want to do what God said. The whole narrative begins there in chapter 5 with who is the Lord or who is Jehovah that I should obey his voice. Pharaoh's, I'm the king, I'm the God, I'm the one who gives the orders around here. And so God said, okay, let's see. And then when he showed him, then he let him loose. See? And Pharaoh changed his mind. So who hath resisted his will? And so they said, well, we haven't resisted God's will. According to your argument, we're doing God's will. No, or nay, but, O man, who art thou that repliest against God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, why hast thou made me thus? Hath not the potter power or authority over the clay of the same lump to make one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor. What if God, willing to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted for destruction? And there he's talking about the nation Israel and the disobedient ones in particular. He says, God endured you, but not because you're special, but because I had a plan and a purpose and a promise to keep. Now, once I did all of that, then it was up to you to decide which way you were going to go. And that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he hath afore prepared unto glory. Talking about the believer, whether Jew or Gentile. Even us, whom he hath called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. So there's Paul's argument. Who are the people of God? The Jews and the Gentiles that believe on Jesus. As he saith also in OC, in the King James, or Hosea, I will call them my people, which were not my people, and her beloved, which was not beloved. And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said unto them, ye are not my people, there they shall be called the children of the living God. That same passage from Hosea is quoted in 1 Peter 2:10 as well, with similar application. But Paul's point is that the people of God, and that's evident from the context in Hosea chapter 1, that the people of God are believers. Just like Abraham was a believer, so those who will be saved will be believers. All right? They'll do what God wants them to do. So, and their number shall be as the sand of the sea. Even though I'm sending this nation, I'm going to scatter them, and there's not going to be 10 of them left in a bunch of 100. Because remember, he found them and they carried them out and buried them. I'm going to destroy this nation. There is going to be a very small remnant of Joseph that will endure. And we saw where they came back in the time of Hezekiah's reign. And then some of them were gathered back when the restoration took place. Because we know there were some from the northern kingdom. I mentioned Anna, the daughter of Asher, there in Luke chapter 2, I think that is. So it shall be said to them, ye are the sons of the living God. Then shall the children of Judah and the children of Israel be gathered together. Now he's talking about a gathering of these two, the reuniting of the nation. That never occurred in temporal history of a literal north and south kingdom reunited again. God said the northern kingdom as a nation is gone. So that nation was destroyed. So the children of Israel be gathered together, and even during the days of Jesus, the intertestamental period, you had the province of Judea, and you had Samaria, and you had Galilee. But those Samaria and Galilee were always under administration by some foreign power. There was never a reunification of the nation as such. So the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together and appoint themselves one head, okay? One head, one king. Just like they did with David. That's a reference back to 2 Samuel. After Saul had perished and the northern kingdom was in rebellion for a little while and Judah was reigned over by David, there was a rapprochement between the tribes, and they named David king. And they did it again after the rebellion of Absalom. They came and made David king. All right, so they shall appoint for themselves one head. Well, he's going to mention David over here in chapter 3. We'll jump ahead a little bit. Afterward, the children of Israel return and seek the Lord their God, and David, their king. Look, we're hundreds of years after the death of David. He's talking about literal David? No, he's talking about Messiah. See? Because 2 Samuel 7 would be fulfilled. One from the loins of David would sit on his throne forever while David was still in his grave. You see, and that's Peter's point in Acts chapter 2. Let me speak unto you of David, who is dead and buried, and his bones are over here. See? So it's not talking about the literal David, but talking about the Messiah. And they shall come up out of the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. And so now you have sowing. God was going to scatter them, but in that scattering he sowed them so that he could gather them back under the gospel. And he's not talking about just Jews. He's talking about Jews and Gentiles. Those who were not my people. The northern kingdom, not my people. Gentiles, not my people. Judah is going to be referred to in the same way. Not my people. And so the messianic element comes in right here in